In this lecture, we're going to have several things before us. One will be to explore the first century church's engagement with one of the Roman Empire's most unjust institutions, slavery. We need, secondly, to understand slavery in the Roman world and not take our assumptions about slavery in the New World to the task of this study. Thirdly, we will examine three means to bring about moral change with respect to Christian responses to slavery. We want to explore how ethical theory can help us think about the data that we discover regarding slavery in the ancient world and what Christians said and did about it. I also want us to have before us the question of slavery in the ancient world in relationship to other ethical issues, and in particular, the issue of homosexuality. The reason for this is that many have tried to make the connection between the church's response to slavery and the church's response to homosexuality. The way that this argument, which is contra orthodoxy, goes is to suggest that the church got it wrong about slavery. Can't everyone agree about that? Therefore, the church can also have, and actually did, get it wrong about homosexuality. My point will be to suggest that these are completely different issues and therefore not related. I've chosen to frame this discussion of slavery in the ancient world and in the early church around the issue of doing Christian ethics. And for this, I would like to refer you to Edward Leroy Long Jr.'s suggestion about three different ways to bring about moral or social change. The first would be institutional, where you try to change the existing structures and also set up new structures. So, for example, one might try to change the system, if it's in education or the judicial system or the political system itself, to topple a government or to change the Constitution or to bring about changes in the law through the legal system of the legislature, the setting up of laws. A second approach that might be taken, different from institutional, is operational change. Here, it's not the structures that one tries to change, but how the power works in and around those structures. And that's the word operational. One might decide to hire and fire people, but still hold on to the position that is in the institution, for example. One might vote new officials into the government, but not change the type of government one has. One can use sanctions in international relationships. One can get involved in protests or even use violence in order to bring about change. This is to put an emphasis on understanding where the power lies and how to use power, how to operate in a way to bring about change. One tries to work around and outside the structures of power as well. One could set up alternative programs. For example, the Underground Railroad for dealing with slavery when one couldn't do away with slavery in the government and in the laws. Or one can talk about promoting alternatives to abortion through advertising and counseling services, even if one can't stop the practice of abortion. So this is the difference between institutional and operational. Now there's a third means for social change that Long points out, and that is the practices of an intentional community. a community that understands itself as separate and distinct from the rest of society. And of course, the early church had this understanding of themselves as an alternative community of God, living differently from the rest of society, either within it or against it, or a mixture of both, depending on the issues and the times. And so one final thing to note is that one doesn't have to choose between these approaches. A group could take an approach trying all three means for bringing about social change, but there are times in which only one option is available, or primarily only one option is available. And I think it should be obvious just from this theoretical slide that when we're looking at the Roman Empire and the pervasive presence of slavery that propped up the institution of the empire itself, that it's very difficult to imagine the small house church communities of the first century of the Christian church trying to address the institution of slavery in that context. And on the other hand, the option that was most available to them was to address their own practices in the intentional communities of the churches that they set up. Let's look first at the Roman institution of slavery and also to some challenges to it. The first point I'd like to make is that we need to understand that Roman society was different from our society. There was a strong understanding of social stratification as well as an authoritarian hierarchy in society itself. Paul Cartledge has said that to Aristotle, slaves were the basis for the good life in the polis, the city, indispensable for enabling free Greek citizens to achieve their full humanity, above all because they provided their masters with the requisite leisure for practicing politics and philosophy. In other words, the very character of the Greek city was dependent upon slavery. Not just the economics, but the whole structure of society was dependent upon slavery. And Aristotle actually said that slaves were of a certain character, distinguishing them from other people. He didn't see them as equal in the sense of being human beings, although if pressed he might have said so, but he suggested that they were of a different type in his description of the slave. And this is one aspect of the intense social stratification of the era. Now, there were also very clear distinctions between people of different levels in society. And that could apply, for example, in the family with the relationship of husband and wife, or parents and children, or masters and slaves, and also the freedmen who continued to owe allegiance to their patron, their former master. And this is just one aspect of the stratification and authoritarian character of society. There were other types of relationships within the military, for example. There was the emperor, and then there was the citizen, and then there were others. There was the father-son relationship or the teacher-pupil relationship and so forth. Seneca pointed out that the Roman world involved a variety of superior-inferior social relationships. The point here is that when we think about the presence of slaves in society, that fits into a larger understanding of the whole society having a stratification and certain people at the top, a minority, being authoritarian and authoritative people, and others subordinate to them. And so it's not simply an issue of slavery, but the stratification of society that we encounter when we try to think about what this looked like from a present day Western perspective after several hundred years of emphasizing freedom and equality in our culture and society. One question we can ask about slavery in the ancient world is which societies owned slaves? And the quick and important answer to give to that is that everyone did. Every culture, that is, or every nationality or every people practiced slavery. There were some exceptions, and these can be noted here. The first exception is the Essene community that practiced common life together, and then also the early church in Jerusalem had this commonality of goods that brought about a kind of communalism and equality in the society. Josephus says regarding the Essenes, "Is there anyone to be found among them who has more than another? For it is a law among them that those who come to them must let what they have to be common to the whole order, insomuch that among them all there is no appearance of poverty or excess of riches, but everyone's possessions are intermingled with everyone's possessions, and so there is, as it were, one patrimony among all the brethren." The early church in Acts chapter 2 practiced a commonality that's similar to what the Essenes did. And we have the story of Ananias and Sapphira claiming to have given the proceeds from a sale to the church when they actually hadn't given all of it to them, and being struck down dead. Now, the important thing to note in that story of the Jerusalem church is that this practice was voluntary. It wasn't required. And yet they were practicing that as a good example to others. And one example is Barnabas himself, who sells a field and gives the proceeds to the church in Jerusalem. But one wasn't required to do that. And that's somewhat dissimilar to the practice among the Essenes. Who became slaves in the Roman Empire? As we ask this question, we're also going to have in the background the question, how can you become free? And also related to that, what does having slaves of this sort mean for the society itself beyond simply the fact of having slaves? And so, for example, the very first point to be made here is that women might become slaves and be sex slaves. Strabo tells us of parents who sold their daughter for temple prostitution, and women who were dedicated to the temple of Aphrodite in Sicily for temple prostitution. Elian tells of an instance of sexual slavery or prostitution. He says, when the Sicyonians captured Pellene, they forced the wives and daughters of the inhabitants to prostitute themselves. By the gods of Greece, that was an extreme of cruelty, as far as I'm aware, unacceptable even among barbarian nations. We have to realize when we collect primary source data that we are not necessarily looking at a practice that's done everywhere. And so Elian points out, yes, this was done, but it was not a common practice. Criminals might also be slaves. Criminals might be sent, for example, to work in the mines, and that was a particularly hard form of slavery. It was often a death sentence. And then thirdly, there was human trade. Anyone could become a slave if captured by a slave trader. Asiatic and European nomadic tribes were involved in the capturing and selling of slaves and hides and other things. We learn from Strabo with reference to an area on the Bosporus. But that is just one example. It was a common practice in ancient society. There's also the caste system in Iberia, or present-day Spain. That is that some people of a certain caste were automatically slaves, and that's not typical of the Roman Empire. There was a ruling class, and then there was a priestly class, and then there were the soldiers and farmers, and then there was a caste of the slaves of the king. Strabo tells us about that as well in his geography. There were also people who were slaves by birth if their mother was a slave, and that was an important distinction. If you were born to a father who was a slave, that might be different, but if your mother was a slave, then you were going to be a slave. People might become slaves because they were captured in war. This was the largest source of slavery in the last 3 centuries of the Roman Republic. That is, leading up until the time of the first emperor, Julius Caesar, just before Augustus Caesar, who dies in 12 AD. So this is just before Jesus, just before our New Testament period. And Aelian says in his historical miscellanies that when the Spartans conquered the Messenians, some men were left to farm, some were sold into slavery, and others killed. And we can imagine this was not atypical. Westerman is an important author on the issue. Writing back in 1955, his work has been quite influential, called The Slave System of Greek and Roman Antiquity. He engages with so many of the primary sources, and a number of those passages I've put into the slide here so a student could go back and look them up in the primary sources. Westerman says that enslavement due to capture of cities during war increased with the wars of the Macedonians, the Macedonian kings. So this takes us back to Philip of Macedon, who is the father of Alexander the Great. The population of Mantinea, Westerman says, was captured in 223 BC and sold into slavery by Antigonus. Philip V sold the inhabitants of Chios, Myrlea, and Thassos in 203 to 202. In 167 BC, the Roman Senate enslaved 150,000 inhabitants of 70 towns of Epirotes, who were mostly Molossians, names we just don't hear at all. And yet these are towns in the Greek part of the world. In the West, we can read about how in 389 BC, Dionysius set free the Rhegians, who could pay a ransom of 1 mina. And this was often the practice. If people were captured and enslaved, then people could pay a ransom to try to get them back. And if they couldn't pay the ransom, then the people were enslaved. Westerman gives other examples of large numbers who were captured and enslaved or set free because of a ransom. Enslavement of conquered people who could not pay ransom increased during the Punic Wars of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Furthermore, Westerman states that in the last 3 centuries of the Roman Republic, the major source of slaves was from those captured during war. And he says, quote, having taken the decision to enslave military captives or the population of a town or district, the imperator, that would be a Roman general, might assign them to state as servi publici, or public servants. And that was, for example, done by Scipio in 212 BC. Or the imperator might bestow them upon the soldiers, a reward for their service. Or he could sell them privately in the locality of their capture, which amounts to a method of ransom individually being arranged with the families of the captives. Or he could sell the entire group at some public auction. The imperator would usually take the money from these sales and give it into the state treasury, although he might decide to use that money for some great public project in the region where the victory was won. And so here we have the biggest source of slavery. Now, note, this is going to be an important point as we talk about how do you get your freedom as a slave. If you're actually a foreign captive, what would that mean to be set free? Another source of slavery was the enslavement of infants who had been left to die by exposure. It was a long and common practice to take an unwanted birth and expose that child to the elements, like up in the mountains. And the assumption would be that the child would die for lack of nourishment, or animals even taking the child, or someone might rescue the child, and then what they would often do is raise the child to a certain age and then sell the child as a slave. Now, this practice is a practice that we read about quite frequently, and is even in some of the plays, like Aristophanes' plays of Oedipus Rex. Oedipus was supposed to have been exposed to the elements, but was rescued and ended up being this person who unwittingly did a terrible thing by actually marrying his own mother. The rescue of unwanted children from death by exposure was an alternative to abortion and orphanages in our day. The master of a slave who wished to intervene and buy back her rescued child had to pay the costs that had been expended for keeping the child. The actual occurrences of rearing of foundlings of both sexes into slavery, being sent into slavery, must have been very numerous, says Westerman. Elian, in his historical miscellany, says it was a law at Thebes, just as at the same time extremely humane, that a Theban could not expose his child or leave it on a wasteland, condemning it to death. But if the father of the infant was extremely poor, whether the child was male or female, he had to take it immediately after the birth in its clothing to the magistrates. They took it and turned it over to the person who accepted the lowest payment for the child. A contract was made with the latter, an agreement whereby he pledged to foster the child and retained it as a slave when it grew up, receiving its services as the reward for having reared it. Now, slaves might also come then from the sale of children due to poverty. Another source of slaves in the ancient world was people selling themselves because they'd fallen into debt. This is also something that Tacitus tells us about, that the German tribes did as well. They sold themselves into slavery to pay off their debts. This is a different kind of slavery because you could work that off, and so it was a kind of self-indenture. There would also be people who chose slavery for love. In AD 52, the Senate required a free woman living with a slave man to become a slave if the owner forbade the union. And so that in that way, someone might choose slavery for love. How many slaves were there? This varied greatly, it seems, throughout the Roman Empire. In some rural areas, there were very few slaves, whereas in some cities, as many as a third of the population might be enslaved. Galen tells us regarding the 2nd century AD that in Pergamum, there were 40,000 citizens in a population of over 120,000. Now remember, a citizen would be a male, so adding the wives for the 40,000 citizens, this means that just over 40,000, or a third of the city's adult population, were slaves. This is high, though, with respect to some other areas, especially rural areas. The Egyptian village of Ptolemais Hormos in the same period, in 192 AD, had 7% as slaves. So we must be wary of assuming that there were a huge number of slaves in certain areas, but also that households had huge numbers of slaves. The wealthy seem to have typically had under 10 household slaves, based on the evidence that we have. Of course, some households would have had a large number. In the 2nd century BC, the Roman state owned silver mines in Spain that used the labors of 40,000 slaves, we're told by Polybius in Strabo. Also, during the Republic, Marcus Crassus had a wrecking and building company that employed 500 slaves in the labors. And Strabo says that the Greek city of Corinth had a temple of Aphrodite where 1,000 female slave prostitutes were used. Now, you need to be aware that Corinth was destroyed by the Romans and then rebuilt. So the Corinth that we read about in Paul's writings and in the 1st century AD is a different Corinth from the Greek Corinth. And so that temple of Aphrodite refers to the period before Paul was there. Strabo also says in his geography that as many as 10,000 slaves were sold at the market on the island of Delphos on the trade route between Rome and Greece to Asia. We know from the slave trade in the modern era from Africa that there were certain centers where the slaves would be gathered and then sold. And so too in antiquity, we have this island of Delphos, known as a slave island, where this trade was practiced. So when you hear a figure such as 20% of the population were slaves, we can say, yes, that applied to cities like Athens and Roman Italy, but not necessarily to other cities or other parts of the empire. I want to talk for a while about what slavery was like. Now remember that many of the slaves were captives who had been saved from death. And so the slaves could be considered, or were considered, the living dead. Also, there was a law that we learn about from the Digest of Justinian called the Dominica Potestas. It allowed whipping, confinement, even execution. The slave owner could cut out the slave's tongue. Slaves were beaten, and physical blows were said to suit the slaves as it reduced them to an abject state. This treatment of slaves was, of course, resented, and we have, for example, revolt of slaves in 135 to 132 BC in Sicily. The cause of the revolt was that the slaves said they were not getting their food rations and that the owners wanted to brand them, according to Diodorus of Sicily. Now, the slave was property, and therefore slaves could technically not own anything. We do find exceptions to this, and so the practice was varied. Some slaves even owned other slaves. We find, for example, a slave by the name of Musicus Scruranus, who owned 16 other slaves. And the scholar Hendrik Moritzen has said that from epigraphic evidence, 61% of the slaves were owned by other slaves or freedmen, and just 39% were directly owned by the elite family members. The elder Cato permitted his older slaves to buy boys, train them for a year, and sell them at a profit. We also find examples of slaves with some money. Sometimes we don't know where it came from. It could be that they stole, or it could be that their owners allowed them to keep some money that they earned. And we do hear of slaves who were getting money in one way or another to buy their own freedom. Regarding marriage, upon capture, an enslaved person's marriage was dissolved, while the slave's legal status was reinstated once the person was freed. Legally, that was called a postlumineum. The marriage was not automatically restored. Only by consent, we learn from Pliny, that that marriage could be reinstated. And then we can say a word about slaves. We think of slavery often from what we know about it in the New World. And in those cases, many slaves, most slaves perhaps, worked in the fields. This is quite the opposite of slavery in the Greco-Roman world, where many slaves were household slaves. You do find slaves working in the mines to their death. Often criminals were assigned that kind of role. Or you find slaves working on large plantations, large farms. So you do find that. But many people would have experienced slavery in the world through observing the slaves of the households. Those with Scruranus mentioned earlier, for example, included a business agent, an accountant, 3 secretaries, a doctor, 2 chamberlains, 2 attendants, 2 cooks, and 3 slaves in charge of clothes, gold, and silver. So we find again a great variety and some very talented slaves who held high positions in a business. Now, we do need to note on the negative side, extreme negative side, that some slaves were sex slaves. And this gets at one of the ongoing challenges we have in our own day with trafficking of young women and putting them into sex slavery. A word about German slavery. Tacitus, writing around AD 100, mentions how German slaves did not have household tasks, but had their own holdings. They had to produce a certain amount for their owners, and they could even be put to death by their owners. But it was a very different picture of slavery from the Roman world itself. There were also a whole category called the freedmen. The freedmen had been slaves and they had been set free by their masters. However, they still had an obligation to the master as their patron. And so, for example, if you'd been an accountant as a slave and your master freed you, you might continue to be an accountant for the family business and owe not only respect, but owe your services to the master. So a large group of freedmen also existed in Roman society. Ninth, slaves were also understood to be the slaves of very elite families, and that would be a different category as well. They were not an economic resource, but they were perhaps an indication of wealth. So a very wealthy family might want to show off the fact that they had a lot of household slaves as part of their showing off their great wealth. So in conclusion, while it must be stated that the situation of a slave was dismal, the condition of a slave may also or may not be dismal. Indeed, the dismissal condition of a slave might lead to a less secure position for that person, just as an underpaid servant in many third world countries today might be better than having no job at all. Let's take just as an example, Paul mentions in Colossians 3:11 that there is no differentiation within the Christian congregation. And there he says there's no Scythian as well. And what that's a reference to is people from, let's say, the area of Chechnya today, that kind of area near Georgia. And the Scythians were far away from Colossae. It would be perhaps a 2,000 kilometer or 1,200 mile trip to get from the one place to the other. So if there was a Scythian in the congregation, or at least in the city that the people would have known about, then that person would have come from very far away. Now imagine dismissing them. Imagine saying, okay, you're free. They're going to have nothing and yet want to get home. And secondly, if they had been a third generation slave, home would not be Scythia anymore. And so they would be not only foreigners, but also have no place to go back to and no money on which to live. So this isn't a defense of slavery. It's just considering the reality of the situation that slaves might be in. So we might think about the difficulty of letting a slave go, as bad as their slave status and perhaps even their slave situation might be. I've made reference to this question before. How could one become free? Now that we have an understanding of where slaves came from and what they did, we can see that there was some difficulty around the idea of becoming free in a world where there were so many slaves. Now, some slaves could buy their freedom. They had been able to make some money or even steal some money, or somehow were able to put the money together. It's possible that in some cases the family could ransom the slave and set them free. It's possible someone else would put up some money. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, when leaving Rome in 7 BC, compared the earlier days to his own day. He said that previously slaves were freed and then became Roman citizens. But he advocated that this should not continue because slaves were stealing and prostituting themselves to gain money to buy their own freedom. And such people should not be citizens. It's also true that often a master might say in his will that he wanted certain slaves to be set free. And then it's possible that someone could marry in the right direction and gain freedom that way. as opposed to the example stated earlier of someone marrying in the wrong direction and having to become a slave for the marriage. And then it's also possible that people became free as a reward for good service. Pliny the Elder says in the 1st century AD that a veritable legion of slaves, a foreign rabble in one's home, had replaced an era when a single slave would suffice in the household. In elite homes, slave ownership was not a matter of financial gain. It was a matter of showing status, wealth, and power. And he laments this condition. So it may be then that with so many slaves, some household might say, look, we might as well let a few go. What were some of the obstacles to gaining freedom or doing away with slavery? In 1 Corinthians 7:21, as the ESV translates it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. The NRSV says, make the most of your situation, and either translation is possible. But in light of what Paul is saying in verse 21 and 23, I think the ESV has the right interpretation. If you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. But what's the problem if you can gain your freedom? Well, there are some problems. Now, Augustus reigned from the end of Julius Caesar's rule up until his death in AD 12. And in 2 BC, there was a law that he published called the Lex Fufia Canonea, and in AD 4, the Lex Aelia Sentia. These were laws regarding slavery. The first law stipulated how many slaves one could free in one's will. The law stated that an owner with 2 to 10 slaves could set up to half of them free. An owner with 11 to 30 slaves could set 1/3 of them free in his will. And if an owner had 31 to 100 slaves, he was allowed to set 1/4 of them free. And then it even goes higher. It says, and if you have 101 to 500 slaves, you could set 1/5 of them free. And nobody could set free more than 100 slaves, though. The purpose of the law was part of several measures to arrest the decline in civic responsibility. Manumission was to be reserved for those who deserved it. Augustus's second law on slavery in AD 24 stipulated that in Rome, a citizen under 20 could not free a slave, and only slaves over the age of 30 would be allowed to be freed. There was also the problem of the pervasiveness of slavery, especially in cities like Athens and Rome. If too many slaves were set free all at once, then suddenly there could be civil unrest in the city. Fourthly, the integration of slavery and freedom into every part of the social structure meant that the economy itself could collapse if people were simply set free, or freedmen were set free of their responsibilities to their former masters. And so there's a serious problem of unraveling the way society had been constructed when you start talking about setting slaves free. A fifth, the possibility of manumission made doing away with slavery more difficult. In this point, what I'm suggesting is that if some slaves, some slaves would work hard in order to be granted their freedom. And so if it's suddenly announced, well, we're going to set you free in any case, then slaves might not work very well in the home. Sixth, the primary source of slaves from conquered peoples made mass release of slaves difficult, and I think this is a very important point. The slave was a foreigner, because the slave came from a conquered people, long distance from home, and also was one of the living dead. And so it's like letting prisoners out of prison. You let people you've conquered go free, what's going to happen? Slavery was part of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, peace that was attained by the Romans by conquering others and enforcing Roman rule throughout the conquered territories. So this posed a serious problem for letting these kinds of people go. Let's turn now to talk about the early church, Christians and the institution of slavery. Paul sees voluntary enslavement as wrong. He says in 1 Corinthians 7:23, "You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human masters." Now the earlier verse 21 of chapter 7, has that translation problem I referenced earlier. But I think what Paul's saying there is get your freedom if possible, in light of what follows in verse 23. Not the way the NRSV translates it as make use of your present condition now more than ever. Furthermore, Christ's example sets an example for all, including slaves, regarding even abuse of authority. In 1 Peter 2:16 through 24, we read, "As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil." And notice the play there, a play that we find also in Paul. You're servants of God, so live as free people. Now, this qualification is going to go the other way as well. Honor everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. Where on earth does this sort of an ethic come from? It comes from the narrative of the cross. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that, free from sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. So Christ is the great example of the righteous sufferer. And in that narrative, slaves can find some purpose to their own situation, even if it is at the hands of an abusive master. Now, you must realize that the alternative isn't go ahead and get free. The alternative is what's listed in the text as becoming abusive oneself and a nasty person, perhaps threatening or doing something that's not good in response to the abusive treatment. And so this then is a word to those in an impossible situation. Also, Christians were to live a quiet life, as we read in 1 Timothy 2:2. This meant that Christians should be careful that what they do, no matter who they are, it has a good reflection on the Christian life. And there were examples in the history of slavery where there were slave rebellions. And then, not as extreme as that, but slaves responding in anger to masters. And Paul has a great concern that people live in such a way that they can represent the faith well. 1 Timothy 2:1-2 says, "First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings and all those in high positions, so that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and dignity." Now, that said, it's also true that we find in both 1 Timothy and in the book of Revelation a negative perspective on slavery. In fact, in 1 Timothy 1:10, slavery is listed as a sin. And in Revelation 18:13, slavery is listed as the very last example of the economy of the Roman Empire. And in chapter 18, the economy of the Roman Empire is seen as a sinful economy in what they're involved with. And they've made a lot of money, but they've done so in a way that it has not been just. And the very last thing that's said is that they have traded in human lives. Now, both 1 Timothy 1 and Revelation 18 refer to the slave trade. And 1 Timothy 1, verses 9 and 10 is actually listing examples of what the Ten Commandments involve. And when you get to the position of the Ten Commandments that says you shall not steal, that is where you find the word for taking people in slavery in the text. So we see here that the early church was undercutting the slave trade itself, and that certainly would have had implications for how the church viewed slavery at the time. We've been talking about institutional approaches to social change. And now let's look at the church and operational change on the issue of slavery. Institutional change was virtually impossible for a small group of Christians in the first century. It was even difficult, as we've seen, within Christian households, and no letter of the law was laid down that Christians should set their slaves free. Had they done so, they would have certainly caused a social problem for the Roman Empire and seen as people who are letting go captives of Rome, among other things. But operationally, the Christian church transformed the status of slaves by identifying Christian ministry not with leaders, but with slaves. And this is an amazing thing to have done. Jesus' ministry involved his taking on the form of a slave, we read in Philippians 2:7. And as we look at several of these examples, you may recollect from a translation that the word servant is used. But that is a translator's choice to go with the word servant instead of slave. And I think that actually the translations often get this wrong. Something more radical is being stated. James, Peter, and Jude, and Christian prophets, and Moses himself were identified with the word slave. Moses is God's slave, as we read in Revelation 15:3. Also, Paul identifies himself as a slave of Jesus Christ. One passage we should consider is 1 Corinthians 4:9. If a Roman general is returning home, there would be a procession, a triumphal procession, a march through the streets of Rome, for example. And behind the troops would be the captured slaves, and those in the very last position would be those prisoners who have been brought back but condemned to death. So we read then in 1 Corinthians 4:9 the following, "For I think," says Paul, "I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. And then in 2 Corinthians 4:5, he says, "For we do not proclaim ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake." And in Galatians 1:10, Paul says, "If I were still pleasing people, I would not be a slave of Christ." Believers were also to see themselves as slaves of the Lord Jesus Christ. We read, for example, in Revelation 11:18 that God would reward his slaves. And in Revelation, John and other believers are slaves of Jesus Christ or of God. Paul also uses this understanding of the believer. Christians are to serve as slaves to the Lord, he says. And this is, of course, an ethical notion, how they are to conduct their lives. Becoming a Christian means to begin to serve God as a slave. The NRSV has in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, to serve a living and true God. And so we see this example not only for the conduct of ministers, but also for average believers. There is an equalizing that's taking place. And imagine in a household reading these letters, and in the household, hearing these letters, are masters and slaves sitting beside each other or in the same room. And the radical social change in that has to do with the theology of the faith would certainly have not stopped there, as the hearers would also understand the implications of this for their social situation as well. Moreover, Christian slaves are to live as free persons. We've seen this already in some passages, but note 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16, which is talking to slaves. Peter says, "Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as," the ASV says, "servants, but as slaves of God." Again, I don't know why these English translations drop the word slave at times, especially in a context like this. Interestingly enough, the idea is also that those who are outside of Christ are slaves too. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 19 says, "People who are outside of Christ are slaves to corruption." So the question, as in Romans 6, is whom are you going to serve? Are you going to serve God, or are you going to serve someone else other than God? The gods of Rome, for example. Or are you going to serve in obedience to righteousness, or are you going to serve corruption? Are you going to serve God or mammon? This kind of choice runs throughout the New Testament literature. And so service seems to be characteristic of everyone. Now, Paul, we've seen, has this idea of himself and his Christians being servants, but also has a word about not becoming slaves yourself. And he reclassifies people in Christ. He says, "For whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a freed person belonging to the Lord, just as whoever was free when called is a slave of the Lord." So he undermines the distinction of master-slave by putting both relationships under the lordship of Jesus Christ, and both slave and master as slaves of Jesus Christ. Paul's discussion of the Lord's table and the practice of the Corinthians at the Lord's table is interesting. We have some social stratification taking place in 1 Corinthians 11, where some people are eating and filling themselves up and even getting drunk on wine, and other people have nothing. And this social stratification would surely have to do with those who had nothing, like slaves, but still part of the Christian community. So Paul calls them to account and to a different practice. He says in verse 21, "For when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry and another becomes drunk. What? Do you not have homes to eat in and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter, I do not commend you." He says that there is to be no contempt for or humiliation of those who have nothing. In this lecture, I've been distinguishing between three different types of bringing about social change in ethics: an institutional approach, an operational approach, which we've just covered, and now we turn to an intentional community approach to looking at change. And we've already begun to lean into this with the last example in particular of thinking about the Lord's Supper as a regular practice of the church, where the different social groups, including slaves and masters, would have been equal in the practice of the Lord's Supper. Now, the intentional community, let's begin by looking at a couple quotes by Michael Gorman in his book, Reading Paul, and then also Becoming the Gospel. Michael Gorman says, "Paul believed himself to be caught up in a divine mission, a mission not everyone appreciated, to spread a powerful word of good news, the gospel, that would establish an international network of transformed, peaceable, multicultural communities worshiping, obeying, and bearing public witness to the one true God by conformity to his Son in the power of the Spirit." And then he says, "The cross of Christ reveals a missional, justifying, justice-making God and creates a missional, justified, justice-making people." So what I'm trying to do here is get at the idea of an intentional community and the effect that intentional identification and living within a larger context, that is the world, what that intentional community would witness to the larger community of the world. So we can begin by talking about Christian virtues. For example, love. Christians are to love each other as well as to love their enemies. And we get both of these ideas in a passage which I'll read at length in Romans 12, 9 through 21. Paul says, "Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality." And that's verses 9 through 13. It's focused on the intentional community. But now we move with the same call to love expressed to those outside the community. Verse 14, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.' To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. Now that's a general kind of comment about a virtue of love and how it can play out both within and outside the community. But think about how that would have been heard by the slave sitting in the congregation receiving this letter. And that's my point, is that virtues like this would have begun to transform the community itself and the community's reputation and relationship to the outside world. Take another virtue, for example, humility. Humility is seen as actually a vice in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It's when you have too little courage. But humility becomes a virtue for those living according to the gospel of Jesus Christ, who humbled himself on the cross. And the passage I want to emphasize is Philippians chapter 2. Verse 3 says, "In humility count others more significant than yourselves." And then Paul will go on in verses 5 through 11 to give the example of Christ, who did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped or held on to, but instead he humbled himself. Now, he humbled himself by taking on the form of a slave. We can also talk about the virtue of freedom along these lines. In Galatians 5:13, Paul says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." So here we have a point we've already made about how Paul flips things around. And the free are actually servants of God, servants of Christ. Those who are slaves are actually free in Christ. And now he says, but don't use, so now he says, you are free, but don't use your freedom to serve the flesh, use your freedom to serve one another. Also, social distinctions are redefined for Christians. We've already seen that Christians are called to be slaves of one another. We've just read Galatians 5:13. We've also seen that there is a reversal of roles, as we looked at the slave and the free person in 1 Corinthians 7:22. Let me read Ephesians 6:5 through 9. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service, people pleasers, but as servants of Christ," or slaves of Christ, "doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." So we've noted that because each relates to the Lord as master, their relationship of master and slave is transformed because both are slaves of Christ. And therefore the slave can do his work unto Christ, and the master needs to realize that he has a master, and that is Christ. And so there's no partiality with him. He doesn't care whether you're a slave or a free person. This is an amazing passage for a house church of masters and slaves to hear and realize that their relationships have to be transformed, that social distinctions are sidelined. They can be honored, but they are not ultimate, and they make no difference to God. And so the last point here is that there are no distinctions. We have those famous passages, Galatians 3:28. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. This doesn't mean, as we've just seen, that social distinctions cannot continue in any given culture and society. They may well continue, but before God, they have no value. 1 Corinthians 12:13, for in the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. And then Colossians 3:11, in that renewal there is no longer Greek or Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. Another aspect of the redefinition of relationships in the church is that the church is often described in familial language. This also applies to the masters and slaves. In 1 Timothy 6, 1 through 2, Paul says that those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers, adelphoi. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. Teach and urge these things. So now the relationship is not in terms of a required obedience, but out of a devotion that one might have toward a brother. And in Philemon, Paul sends Onesimus back to his master Philemon and says that he comes back no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. It's not just a spiritual brother, but now even he can use the language of a brother in the flesh. He comes back to you. So treat him that way. This is a remarkable transformation of relationships in the church, even if some of the social distinctions remain and they're from outward appearances, they might be similar to what is practiced in unbelieving homes, but they've been transformed in Christ. Related to this is the fact that the rich are warned. This is a common theme throughout the New Testament writings, and Jesus himself warned the rich. In 1 Timothy, we've been in 1 Timothy 6, just a few verses later, we read two warnings to the rich. Paul says, but those who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and in their eagerness to be rich, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. Then verse 17, as for those who in the present age are rich, command them not to be haughty, or to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but rather on God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, generous and ready to share, thus storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of the life that really is life. Here Paul seems to be reflecting the very words of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6:19 and following, about storing up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Now imagine how this would have been heard in a congregation where people from different social strata would be sitting together. The rich would feel their ears burning hearing this. And yet, of course, that's not the purpose of this. But the challenge really comes down to, you can be rich, but you better be rich in the good things you do. And so this is another aspect of the transformed relationships that would have applied to various groups, including the masters and the slaves in the congregation. Fourth, difficult circumstances, even being enslaved, can be missional opportunities. Paul sees this in his own life as he's a prisoner. He also sees it possibly in a marriage situation where some believers find themselves married to unbelievers. They've come to faith and their spouses haven't. And then also it applies to slaves. In Titus 2, 9 through 10, we read, "Tell slaves to be submissive to their masters and to give satisfaction in every respect. They are not to talk back, not to pilfer, but to show complete and perfect fidelity, so that in everything they may be an ornament to the doctrine of God our Savior." That's not unlike what Paul says to wives married to unbelievers, believing wives married to unbelievers in 1 Timothy 3, where he says, "Without a word, win them to the word." But also on the topic of slavery, we've seen what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, 12 through 15, about how the difficult circumstances of a slave, even if there's a mean master, can be a witness to the Lord. The last verse, verse 15, says, "For it is God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish." We might also ask the question, how would Christians have read the Old Testament on slavery? First of all, we should note that the church saw themselves in the narrative of the Old Testament, because Israel was the people of God and the church was the people of God. And so, in some important ways, the church was Israel and Israel was the church. So there's a similarity and there's a continuity between Israel and the church. But it's not an absolute identity. The church is made up of Jews and Gentiles. There are no ethnic distinctions, as we've seen, in the church, because of people are in Christ. And so we've noted these verses before: Galatians 3:28, 1 Corinthians 12:13, and Colossians 3:11, where Paul says this. Now, they might also have heard some of what was said in the Old Testament in relationship to their circumstances. The Old Testament said that an Israelite was not to enslave a fellow Israelite. And so what we have are indentured servants, because people fall into debt. But you don't have an Israelite who is a slave of another Israelite, and they're to be let go in the Sabbath or Jubilee years. Now think about what that would mean then for Christians. The master and slave relationship is no longer going to be considered a master and slave relationship, but rather they are fellow Israelites. And they are to treat each other even as brothers. The language brothers is used in Deuteronomy 24:7. If a man is found stealing one of his brothers, the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. So the Old Testament offers a perspective that does relate to what Paul says about people in the church being brothers of one another, including masters and slaves. And then also the Old Testament remarkably says not to return a runaway slave. Perhaps an abused slave is what's behind this. But in Deuteronomy 23:15-16, we see it written, "You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns. Wherever it suits him, you shall not wrong him." And so here we have an interesting distinction, because this verse applies to the Old Testament, but in the New Testament period, the laws of the Roman Empire applied, and one was required to return a runaway slave. And if one had benefited from services of a slave before returning him to the master, the person was liable to pay that for those services to the master. So there is this requirement about the returning of runaway slaves. So when we come to a little letter like Philemon, we see Paul under pressure of the Roman government to return Philemon, but not under the Old Testament law. And yet he does so on the basis that Onesimus is going back to a brother who is valuable to him as a brother rather than he's returning him as a slave. And finally, very briefly but profoundly, the slave trade is condemned. I've mentioned these passages earlier. 1 Timothy 1:8 through 10, interpreting some of the 10 commandments, replaces the commandment not to steal with the example of enslavers. And then in Revelation 18, the bad practices of the Roman Empire and in their economy and their exploitation of people through their economy ends with, and they even trade in human souls. And so the church was critical of this practice of the Roman Empire. We began this lecture by looking at how one can bring about social change. And we suggested, with reference to the work of Edward Leroy Long Jr., that there are 3 ways in which social change might be attempted. One might attempt it institutionally, operationally, or through forming intentional communities. And having looked at many aspects of slavery in the Greco-Roman world and in the early church, we can say a few things. Institutionally, the institution of slavery could not be changed. I think that's quite clear. But freedom was encouraged, and slave traders were considered sinners, and the slave trade was condemned. Operationally, there was a new understanding of masters and slaves and power and service. And this relates to the final way in which you can bring about change, and that is through intentional communities. The community of the church stood in stark contrast to the world of the Roman Empire. It was a radically altered community in which people related to each other as brothers in a family, and that also greatly altered the way in which masters and slaves related to one another.